I think you will be able to answer at the end of today's session. So I'm going to deliberate upon what is metafiction, how is it connected to postmodernism, very briefly, and how it problematizes history. So now the whole question is, um, as we all know, that history is always connected with stories from the past. And we create our present, and these stories of our past establish our identity and help us also to find identity. And what do you mean by this identity? That is the simple fact that who we are and what we are. And sometimes, unfortunately, some of the stories are erased, and then we become people with no history, no records. I'm sure that you might have heard about burning of libraries. Burning of libraries in the sense that when there is a war or when there is a kind of a fascist power coming to regime, the first thing that they do is burn the library. So what does it do? It does not take away knowledge, but it also erases the history of people. I'm sure that you are familiar with Subigi Rao, who has worked intensely on the burning of libraries and the oldest libraries that have been destroyed mercilessly, including our Takshashila. So I'm not, since our topic is not to deliberate upon this, but I'm saying that these stories are very important. I'm not specifying the word history, but I'm saying that these stories are actually records of what we are and who we are. And stories are created in order to glorify a tradition, perhaps, and sometimes they become modified reality. And can we call them stories of convenience? I'm posting these questions to you, and we all know that we live in an era which fiction has been divided rigorously as it has ever been into as high art and low art. So there is a pointer towards cultural studies. So what my point is, when we discuss postmodernism, when we discuss subaltern studies, when we discuss post-colonialism, or when we discuss translation studies, all these are very much connected with what you term as what you term as the strongest word, the problematical word, culture. So we live, as I said, that is why I use. So what I say is that is purposefully the reason why I use the two terms high art and low art. And high art has mostly been dispensed with the narrative and with the storyteller's tradition of entertaining, abandoning the activity to popular films, media, entertainment, pulp fiction, television, much as painting is abandoned, painting abandoned portraiture and landscape to a photographer's camera. That is only illusion that I could come up with. And so literary fiction has even abandoned the illusion of reality. You must be wondering, what is reality? I would say that reality is, or reality is modified. It is modified. It is modified reality. It is not the real reality. And it prefers to concern itself with the fictional process, with fictional process, with what has been called meta narrative, which means not the relationship between the reader and reality, as interpreted by the written word, but the relationship between the author and the story, perhaps it is vice versa, the reader and the story. So I was thinking, like, I have spent years of my life, as you have been, reading history, reading stories and poetry. I've always asked myself this question: why do we read fiction? And when I ask my students, when I teach fiction, when I teach any novels, I ask the students, why do we read fiction? Why do we read all these novels? The students in my class answer differently. They say they read wisdom, they read fiction for wisdom, they read it for knowing the truth. It is a search for experiencing beauty of life, to meet different kinds of people, which you term as character, to experience different emotions, to maybe relax and to learn about life. These are the answers that we get usually in a classroom when we discuss about fiction. And why do we read fiction? Again, the question comes. We read fiction because it affects us emotionally. It affects us emotionally in that specific way that it set it off from every other kind of emotional response. You can think about what I've said. You can situate yourself in this particular monstrous line. We read fiction because it affects us emotionally, and it affects us emotionally in that specific way that set it off from every other kind of emotional response. So what I mean is, narrative, this particular narrative generates a particular kind of emotional response that we can obtain from no other kinds of experience except for comparable narratives in drama, maybe television, film, oral, and also, of course, the grandmothers who have narrated stories from the past, or mundane stories which we recollect so much. So you feel for the characters when you read. Sometimes you say, after reading that particular novel, I couldn't, it haunted me for so many days. It made me feel so depressed. So you feel for the characters, you meet in an imaginary space. There, they somehow create an alternative reality which is so powerful. They colonize you totally. Then comes the question, that question of language of these narratives. That itself is an area that you can situate many theories. But I should tell you that fiction has been defined by as interesting people in different difficult times, or as John Ciardi puts it, character under stress. Fiction is nothing but character under stress. And Stanley Elkin, who is not very common, is not a very common theorist, but he has used similar words when he called fiction character in crisis. And this is exactly what we find in fiction. And we want interesting people who look ordinary, who engage our attention and would begin to involve us in the process of our narration. We want these characters to engage us. Our stories need complications. It's not just he fell in love and he married her and then something happened. Not that kind of narration. The ordinary narrative will never engage, will never offer any kind of pleasure, any kind of satisfaction. And art stories need complications, and then efforts of characters, and we need those characters to take efforts to resolve their situation. And the most effective narratives are those where the characters grow into a condition in which they might fail to solve the problem, or sometimes solve it, developing moral strength, or failing miserably, or becoming more wise to tackle under stress, and this is what which catches our attention, and our concern for the character touches the peak, and from that we obtain our greatest reward, and then we derive pleasure. Now, I would situate, I'm discussing only two novels today, and one is John Fowles' A Maggot, very briefly, because it is a most complex novel that I have come across. It is so dense, very difficult to crack, because it offers you not only linguistic complications but also structural complications when it comes to plot. And then the novel that I've always wanted to discuss, that is Sugandhi Elias Andal Devanayagi, which I'm just discovering, and I'm so happy that my colleague and my dearest friend Priya translated it, and she has done an incredible job, I should say. And this engages you. The language is so simple. The language makes you, it creates, it is I wouldn't say it is apolitical, it is political, and it creates anxiety. And that is a typical characteristic or typical characteristic of postmodern fiction, and it is also the typical characteristic of historiographic metafiction. So this is exactly, these are the two novels. There are plenty of novels that you can find in this particular essay that is prescribed for you, Historiographic Metafiction by Linda Hutcheon. There are almost 30 novels that are prescribed, that is, she critiques that. But since there is a restriction on time, I thought I would take this particular novel, Sugandhi Elias Andal Devanayagi and A Maggot, which is, I hope, John Fowles. This particular novel is not very easy to crack, but I feel if you are able to crack, you feel that it provides you with a lot of pleasure, and you feel that by understanding the complexities that it offers, you feel that you obtain your greatest reward, and that is derived pleasure. And in this, when it comes to pleasure, there is one interesting reading that I came across, and this particular theorist is named Robert Scholz, and he said he equates a reading of fiction and deriving pleasure from reading of fiction to the physiological release of tension, and he equates it to our sexual experiences, which also, he says, exhibit a narrative structure, a beginning, middle, and an end. And he goes on to say, we also experience tension, climax, and a resolution. And this is exactly that you find in this book, page 131, where in page 131 of, you can go to that page and look at the way in which T.D. Ramakrishnan has accommodated this, equated this particular observation, and it says, and in this particular context, he comes with the idea Jnana Saraswati is portrayed in a sensual form. I quote, "It is because it is the purest and most beautiful form of goddess, and knowledge in human beings work on three levels." I'm not reading the entire section, and then he concludes that with a particular, I don't know, it as you read, it gives you immense, this is the greatest reward in reading this particular text, and it gives you a lot of happiness when you confront this kind of a very, he has experimented with with fiction, the art of fiction, and the craft that Priya has engaged herself with. Her craft is amazing, I should say, and it's so simple, so lucid, and so candid. And it goes on to say the same, it carries the same overtone. It says, I quote, "The limitless possibilities that knowledge offers is ultimate aim of those who seek it. Man always hunts for pleasure, and lust is the greatest way to pleasure. All seekers of knowledge try to make sex more enjoyable. That is why Jnana Saraswati is depicted as sensual. This reading, I don't want you to be enslaved. I unquote this. I don't want you to be enslaved to this particular reading, but I would always want you to associate how you read fiction and why do we read fiction. And this is something what I thought, the observation made by Robert Scholes, and how our writers have maybe accidentally, maybe they have thought about the craft that they should they should be they might have been obsessed about, and the whole idea of fiction writing assumes a totally different dimension. Now we come to the discipline of, so I have deliberated upon fiction. Why do we read fiction? And now we come to the point that the discipline of history and literature have, like many other fields of critical inquiry, since the advent of Saussurean and Peircean semiotics, been re-evaluating the premises of their enterprise. And the threadbare truth, that is your takeaway for this session. Because what you conceptualize as truth gets fragmented, gets destabilized. And that is why I have used the word, the threadbare truth offered by linguistics, that language, the basis of our knowable reality, the only knowable reality, is found upon an arbitrary and essentially meaningless relationship between signifier and signified. And that has caused both fields to examine anew the textual coding. I have to use that word, text. Am I there?
Yes, now you're audible, ma'am. No.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Can you see the presentation?
Yeah, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much. So, so this is exactly, that is you. So writing after one of the momentous, so this whole concept of truth is which is problematized by in historiographic metafiction as well as postmodernism. So writing after one of the momentous historical events of our century, the apocalyptic years of World War I, the philosopher historian R.G. Collingwood roots in his genealogical study of historiography in the ancient debate between Herodotus and Thucydides. But I should say Herodotus is interested more in a history of events, whereas Thucydides analyzed the laws which ordered these events. So this was the difference between both these historians, and he sees it is an attempt to describe the development of historiography. I think the basic reading of historiography should start from this British historian, R.G. Collingwood, which I hope it is very interesting reading, British historian, and he is the one who traces the history of historiography. And coming back to the narrative, that is the following the evolution of historical writing, Collingwood's particular study called The Idea of History. I forgot to mention the name of the book, The Idea of History. He traces historiography from multiple narratives of Herodotus to Livy, to Renaissance and to Enlightenment. And the single history in quotation mark of Hegel and Marx. There is no time to elaborate on that. And Collingwood does not merely catalogue the change in the philosophical underpinnings of historiography, but he problematizes the whole narrative of history. So instead of merely working within what he condescendingly defines as a common sense theory of historiography, he challenges and problematizes the premise of each historiographical system. For example, his argument reminds us of Aristotle. All of us know what Aristotle said about art and history. So Aristotle said art in general, in the wide sense, represents or narrates the possible, and history represents or narrates that which has really happened, not might have happened, but really happened. And Collingwood draws a comparison between these similarities of historians and novelists. And the novel and history, he says, should make one thing possible, and that is make sense. Both novel and history are self-explanatory, self-justifying, and we understand that it is a product of an autonomous or self-authorizing activity, and in both cases, this activity is a priori imagination. So this way of understanding history, which reminds us of Hayden White's notion of narrativization, which came years later. And Hayden White stresses the importance of Collingwood, what Collingwood calls the constructive imagination. So these are the two terms that I want you to understand. One is this whole historiography of history, historiographical system, and what was important in it was constructive imagination, and the other ingredient is common sense. And the way of understanding history stresses the importance of what Collingwood calls, what I termed as constructive imagination, and then we should connect it to the theory, the most I don't know, complex theoretician or philosopher that we ever had, that is Nietzsche, who suggests there are no facts in themselves. For a fact to exist, we must first introduce meaning. So this is what exactly lies with history and fiction, and also the concept of historiographic metafiction. And by use of interpolation, one could argue the historian concretizes the gap between historical events and thus makes a narrative without which we could have no history at all. So the novelist according to him, he has got only one single task, to construct a coherent picture, and the historian has more. The role of a historian is more problematic. He has a duty to provide historical facts which could be validated, and Collingwood argues a historian must write a coherent narrative around unavoidable historical details, which the novelist is subject to the demands of narrative only. He further shows up this narrative whole in scientific history's defense by presenting 3 rules which guide the historian's craft, and to which he would claim the novelist is not a subject. So the historian's image of the past must be localized in time and space. History must be consistent with itself. The historian's picture stands in a peculiar relation to something called evidence. Here starts our journey, or the connection between history and fiction. So as we look at it, Collingwood's a peculiar relationship between the historiographical text and evidence is similarly flaunted by Daphne Marlett's Anna Historic, which is not very common but very interesting reading, in which Anna's recovery from the forgetful chauvinistic historical record is almost total. And the same thing you can find in, sorry, one second. In the same book, Sugandhi alias Andal Devanayaki, there is the eraser of memory, complete erasing of memory. And the same thing you can find in this particular text, which was in, which is the same technique, which is the same literary device, I should say, is used in Sugandhi alias Andal Devanayagi, where Devanayagi's memories are also erased. So in coming back to Anna Historic, foregrounds the minimal presence of women. So this is why history becomes a problem, and that is a question. That is why we are revisiting history, because usually we say that women not only forms a particular class, but is also a caste. And coming back to this particular book, Anna Historic by Daphne Marlett, she says, citing the brief, foregrounds the minimal presence of women in official record in order to work against history's ideologically created silence. Citing the brief entrance of a woman into Vancouver's public record, Marlett writes history unsaid. She says by 1873, she is there, named in the pages of history as Mrs. Richards, a young pretty widow who fills the suddenly vacated post of a school teacher. There ends the story. So deliberately foregrounding Mrs. Richards' lack of name as well as definition of the self by other, Marlett's text does not attempt to mine official documents in order to construct a past, but rather reveals the absence which is woman in traditional historiography by self-consciously creating both name and life for this unsung woman. So postmodern historiographic metafiction works within by either tacitly accepting or self-reflexively undermining these historiographical conventions in order to foreground the constructed nature of the conventions themselves as ontological objects of inquiry. So another important critic that comes is Louis Mink in his famous book, canonical work, narrative form as a cognitive instrument. He picks upon the same. I'm tracing the entire genealogy of historiographic metafiction. He also compares with which led to the canonical work that was given to us by Linda Hutcheon. He argues that a narrative is primary and irreducible form of human comprehension used by history as a transparent entity to organize historical truth. So he claims that common sense historiography, which was used by Collingwood, like that which Collingwood defines, works out of presuppositions from universal history, which presumes that history relates actual stories. So that is what we think, and that is why we considered history as a grand narrative. So Mink questions the naturalized nature of these presuppositions by asking, and here he quotes Kant, how we discover in the plethora of details that are given to us a single central subject or theme in the unfolding of the plot of history. He asks how it is in both fiction and history that narrative defects the evidence in its selection of events. Now I will also tell you uh, uh, the story of what happened in Kashmir. You know, the real narratives of Kashmir are never, ever highlighted. See, there are different schools of thought. So you need to, let us, when we confront this theoretical premise, let us equate this to the situation that is very much a part of modern India or postmodern India, not postmodern India. So there are different narratives that are constructed. Look at the kind of narratives that form a part of nationalism, the different narratives that are used in films, especially pertaining to nationalism. So how to describe nationalism becomes a most important question for us. So the same way we feel that taking this analysis one step further, Mink also questions the seeming consensus which defines a historical event. This is similar to Nietzsche's questioning of facts. He suggests that this narrative organizes its selection of events and that an event is an abstraction from a narrative. So Mink contrasts the faith of an objective history that presupposes that past actuality is an untold story and that there is a right way to tell it, with the conceptual alternative version. So this discomfort, he assures us, is not shared by fiction, but in historiographic metafiction, I'm telling you, this is exactly what you experience. Now, because we are almost 40 minutes, so I wanted to discuss Hayden White briefly. I'm not going to elaborate. This is very important when you, because this particular text, Meta History, where he examines history, where he questions the epistemological status of historical knowledge and the role of narrative in historical presentation. And he argues history remains in the state of conceptual anarchy. So this narrative is a meta code which informs both fiction and historiography, and that historical text shares many of its code within the literary artifact. So he claims that historians select and organize historical information in specific patterns in order to make their rendering more understandable to an audience of a particular kind, and insists that the idea that you have found coherence in the historical record implies a belief, a desire for a kind of a formal coherence. So what I say is, in Hayden White's romance, the hero overcomes his or her world, and in his satire, we are victims of fates. So comedy allows its characters a temporary triumph, and tragedy allows the audience to gain consciousness. Both the novelist and historian share this emplotment. That is a word that he uses to bring in the subject matter, its strategies of exclusion and demand for emphasis. The plausibility of history, says White, is not not on the coherence of the facts so ordered, but on the historian's skill in matching up a set plot structure with a series of facts. So what we conclude from this is, for both history and fiction, facts are constituted by the questions we ask and are carved up and selected always by a manifest or latent motive or aim. So White would disagree with the freedom that Collingwood allow allows is a priori constructive imagination. So what we should infer from this is this whole process that we indulge in, whether it comes to history, whether it comes to fiction, the fine line that divide history and fiction gets erased when it comes to historiographic metafiction. So what you term as history is nothing but truth. That is what which becomes questioned in historiographic metafiction, according to Linda Hutcheon. So now another important critique that we should keep in mind when we discuss historiographic metafiction is none other than Foucault, whose paradigm has politicized and historicized the notion of the discursive text, in which provocative and politically meaningful ways also describe the ideological power of language and knowledge in society. So Foucault's methodology, by refusing to accept the traditional distinction between literature and non-literature, subverts the whole notion of literature's distinctive qualities by calling for a literary criticism which is aware of both history and literature's provisional and ever-changing character. And that is the reason why Foucault heavily problematized the notion of an author function as a guarantor of meaning. Guarantor of meaning can work, that is what I refer to is meaning making within social convention. So Foucault claims that social institutions construct themselves through these types of discursive practices, building rules and systems that make possible certain structures and signification, and they thus enable certain types of knowledge. So what we should understand is that history and fiction, when it comes to history as the grand truth, that is what which gets destabilized in postmodern fiction, so and postmodern times. So that this is exactly what we infer in excerpts from the history of sexuality, and in that he envisions power as a site upon which numerous discourses are sought through a fluctuating dynamic equilibrium of power relations. So there is a link between power and knowledge which characterize the disciplinary character of all modern political organization and institutional practices. So the notion of hierarchical power is what which colors history. So this is exactly why this is not you might remember, I think you might have read the book which has become a bestseller, that is Anarchy by William Dalrymple. It is a non-fiction, but he destabilizes the history of colonial India, and he says we cannot blame the British. We cannot blame the British, but it was the Jagat Seths of Calcutta who made this colonization possible in India. It was because of their funding. It was because of the funds that the Jagat Seths provided Clive that India became a colony under British. So this placement of the text and subject in history is not in any sense a conventional understanding of history, and this is exactly what Foucault says, and he treats history as a series of specific and concrete but changing events which occur by chance and exist with their own interrelationship. And this theoretical stance approaches history by foregrounding the way in which both production and consumption of the historical text shows it to be writing practice constituted within a restrictive discourse, and that is history. The implications of this linguistic analysis of power has for the subject in history are far ranging. And one example, the recent example is this particular news that you might have read, Dublin-based Gabriel Rosenstock sending fragrance of invisible flowers to Varvara Rao. Masood Hussain, who is a Srinagar-based artist who is imprisoned in Mumbai prison, who is 81, he's an octogenarian, and he is affected, he's still under, he's suffering, he is affected with, he is also suffering from COVID-19, and he is, I hope you remember, who is imprisoned in Mumbai prison, who is arrested for Elga Parishad case. I'm not going to elaborate. And this beautiful poem that this is a typical example of how history is, history gets affected by ideological power structures. This beautiful poem that he wrote, the Dublin-based poet Gabriel Rosenstock wrote, I send you invisible flowers, Varvara Rao, to perfume your cell and bring smile to your lips that I will not see, they may not last long. You can Google and you can read. I'm restricting myself. I'm going to do the second part, that is at least historiographic metafiction. We should. Are you bored? Let me take a break. Can I have any response from the...
Okay, ma'am. Okay. Please take.
Pardon?
Please take a break.
No. I just wanted to, so we will now focus on, I just wanted you to understand how history and fiction and what are the critical texts, what are the theoretical texts that you need to keep in mind when you approach historiographic metafiction. Usually you can just elaborate on what you mean by historiographic metafiction. There are plenty, but I just wanted to connect some unknown texts that would be waiting for you to examine. These are very interesting reading, so I thought I would just connect you with these texts, and that is why I elaborated on how this whole concept, and then the whole concept, how theoretically you can connect all these to the concept of historiographic metafiction. So now we would come to talk about historiographic metafiction. This I have already mentioned. Why do we, and this is the particular thing that he has also, T.D. Ramakrishnan has mentioned in this particular novel, Sugandhi alias Devanayaki. Why do we write novels? To rewrite history. And that is what he has done in this particular book. And this is exactly what John Fowles has also done in both the novels, A Maggot and also I love this particular novel, French Lieutenant's Woman. And these are the two novels that you should compare, juxtapose and analyze. And these are the best books to understand the concept of historiographic metafiction. So we now come to the concept that is given to us by Linda Hutcheon. That is, Linda Hutcheon says that we were taught that history is absolute truth, a truth of events that happened in the past, a grand narrative that establishes nothing but truth. And literature and history were considered branches of the same tree of learning. It is accepted that history is the voice of the established power structures, and that it is extremely political. Historiographic metafictions can be summed up in understanding history is nothing but modified fiction, and fiction is nothing but modified reality. And it is a dream in the mind of humanity striving towards perfection. So now the whole premise is open to you. What is history? We have problematized history. What is fiction? Why do we read fiction? And how we can problematize fiction. So this is what Linda Hutchins says. It is a dream in the mind of humanity, forever striving towards perfection. And the question that comes to your mind is, who writes stories? Who benefits from stories? Think about history. Who are the ones who benefits from history? Why do we manipulate history? Who is missing from these stories? These are the questions that I want you to keep in your mind. And Linda, again, historiographic metafiction says history and fiction are notoriously porous genres with elastic boundaries, and they influence each other. And this is which is exploited to the maximum in all the postmodern texts and in all those novels which are labeled as historiographic metafiction. The same literary device is used by Salman Rushdie in Midnight's Children. Amitabh Ghosh, he does the same thing. And also in God of Small Things, a classic, a book that offers challenge to you each time you take the text and read it. It erases the elastic. It makes you conscious of the fact that history and fiction are notoriously porous genres. The story of Ammu, the story of Kerala, there are multiple narratives that you confront. And why is history so important in modernist and postmodernist thought is a question that I pose to you. I'm not going to answer it. I would only say that postmodern theory challenges the idea of the individual or an institution's ability to write factually about observable reality. So we come to the conclusion that they are merely linguistic constructs. Critical readings now focus on what these two disciplines share and how they differ. They derive their force from verisimilitude rather than objective truth. And you also say that they are not at all transparent, especially when you examine the language and structure. They are equally intertextual. They deploy the text of the past within their complex textuality. This is exactly what you find in the multiple stories that you hear about Sugandhi, Elias, Devanayagi, and also a maggot which is fashioned as a detective story. The novel comes to you in the form of an interrogation. It is a detective novel. It comes in the form of question answers. So it is self-reflexive and it is paradoxical, and they also lay claim to historical events. And I am posing you the question, why is history so important in modernist and postmodernist thought? You might be wondering what this crazy teacher is asking. Herodotus, the father of history, provides a catalogue of events, characters, interaction that covers a period. And according to Aristotle, historian tells us what has happened, and the poet thinks of things that might happen. For this reason, as we have observed in the lines of the poet who has written from Dublin, poetry is more philosophical and more worthy. Poetry is concerned with more universal truths about human nature. So, poetry is there on one side, history is there on one side, and fiction is there on one side. I'm leaving this answer to, I'm leaving I'm not leaving an answer for you, but I want you to contemplate and problematize why is history so important for fascist regimes. Now we come to the next. See, Hegel says the term spirit, each age has got us, the Victorian era, or when you look at colonial history of India, each age has got a spirit, a Zeitgeist, spirit of the time. That means spirit of the time. History is made up of succession of spirit that replace one another. Contradictions, as the contradiction thrown by the earlier one is reconciled, and more powerful methods of understanding and interacting and governing are replaced. I would give you one example, feudalism, for example. See, look at the spirit that controlled. What was the prevailing spirit, essence of feudalism? Feudalism was replaced by something else, isn't it? No, you say that the revolutions that shook up Europe, French Revolution, Russian Revolution. So each era has got a spirit, and this is replaced by French Revolution. It was, you said that it is the spirit of equality, fraternity and liberty, and then it was replaced by again dictatorship. Napoleon the Bonaparte came into power. See and so that, and now when you take the literary arena, there is modernism, and then there is an intellectual rupture that is happening, and that is what we term as the postmodern condition. See, it is a condition. So you need to link this with history. And history is a rational process, a dialectical movement where the self has to penetrate and digest the entire wealth of its abundance. And you have to examine within this premise why. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're quite audible.
Yes. So what has this postmodern writing taught us? The postmodern writing of both history and literature has taught us both history and fiction are discourses. They constitute systems of signification by which we make sense of the past. So exertions of shaping, ordering of imaginations is done to shape events in the past. The meaning and shape are not in the events, but in the systems which make those past events into historical facts. So postmodernism reinstalls historical context as significant and even determining. Hence, we say it problematizes historical knowledge. So because of the lack of time, I would just touch upon metafiction. And John Fowles, this is what he says: fiction is woven into all. I find this new reality or unreality more valid. And metafiction is a type of fiction about fiction itself. And metafiction is a term that is given to fictional writing, which self-consciously and systematically draws our attention to its status as an artifact in order to pose questions about the relationship between fiction and reality. So the simple notion that language passively reflects a coherent, meaningful, and objective world is no longer tenable. Metafiction becomes a discourse through which human beings reflect, use their own language, construct and mediate their experience of the world. So this whole concept of metafiction is merged into the concept of historiography, and then we need to link into historiographic metafiction. So how is it possible? The question that comes to us is, how is it possible to describe anything? The metafictionist is highly conscious of a basic dilemma. If he or she sets out to represent the world, he or she realizes fairly soon that the world as such cannot be represented. In literary fiction, it is in fact possible only to represent. That is why we have multiple representations in maggot, and multiple narration that you find in Sugandhi alias Devanayagi. And if one attempts to analyze a set of linguistic relations using those same relationships as the same instruments of analysis, language soon becomes a prison house from which the possibility of escape is remote. No wonder Salman Rushdie, all the postmodern writers place or kind of indulges in using or fluctuating language as much as possible. They play with language, and that language and thus language plays a crucial role, a powerful role in forcing us to accept these modified reality. And we are forced to accept the most important fact. What we accept in life, we cannot accept in history. That is lies and fabrication. So, language plays a crucial role in conveying this most powerful lesson to us, and that is what we accept in life, we cannot accept in history. That is lies and fabrication. So that is why I said historiographic metafiction is nothing but linking of fictitious to mendacious stories and histories, and historiographic metafiction is obsessed about linking these mendacious stories and problematizing history. So we come to the fact that, I'm skipping all this, we come to the conclusion that is, in historiographic metafiction, what you witness is the destabilizing of history. It is the describing of history, and the reality that you confront in historiographic metafiction is a modified reality, and the readers are forced to engage in a kind of intellectual game, or also an emotional game, and they are made to search for truth. In all these stories, that is in John Fowles especially, he uses, I would strongly recommend that you focus your attention on language. That is what you ignore when you focus on the plot, on the theme and narration. Sometimes you overlook how they use language to take this to a totally different level, and to force us not to accept history, which gives us lies and fabricated truth. Fowles uses the disruption of narration as a technique to bring out the self-reflexivity. And as I said earlier, A Maggot is a detective novel. And according to Linda Hutcheon, in order to understand this model of self-reflexivity that is used by John Fowles, one must first identify three major characteristics of detective fiction. They are the self-consciousness of the form itself. The second one is its rigid conventions and textual function of the hermeneutic reading of the text itself. So the reader's understanding of the story is developed through, as I said earlier, question and answering session. Reader is forced to take an active role in producing meaning. So there is this character. I leave you to, I am not going to elaborate on the story. That will be too much for you to take. So the main character is Detective Henry Ascough, and you find him searching for truth. And with him, you also embark on this journey searching for truth. And Ascough is a lawyer, and Maggot also forces you to understand. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, you are.
Yes. In Maggot, as you read, the reader is also engaged in the painful act of separating fiction not from history but fiction itself. And the epilogue of this book is very challenging, as throughout the book the writer playfully invades the novel to give an abundance of information about 18th century and illustrates our freedom to reconstruct both history and story. And then the word maggot, I still remember it was so difficult for us to decipher the meaning of what it means. Fowles describe in the prologue that a maggot means whim, quirk, obsession, a snatch of music, earthworm. There lies the complexity, in addition to its more contemporary meaning of the larval stage of a fly. His multi-valence foregrounds the imprecise nature of language and in turn the paradoxical relationship between language and reality. Fowles suggests that he wrote the novel out of an obsession with a theme, the image of travelers, faceless, without apparent motives, went in my mind towards an event, unquote Fowles. And he draws his attention of his readers how history or fiction is written, as he has created a fantasy about a religious sect which is called the Shakers, that is completely different from their history. Thus, the technique of writing history and fiction is laid before the reader. And that is why we say fiction is converted into an artifact by all these writers who have experimented with historiographic metafiction. I'm not going to deliberate upon Sugandhi alias Andal Devanayagi. I should only say that this is yet another example of historiographic metafiction, and T.D. Ramakrishnan has problematized the history of Elam movement in Elam movement in Sri Lanka. He universalizes the struggle of freedom by mixing it with the invented myth of Devanayaki, who valiantly fights against the atrocities of King Mahinda using her brains as well as her body. And the author leaves a powerful message for us. Devanayaki will be born or reborn wherever and whenever a woman gets exploited. So each attempt becomes to retell the past ends in a crisis. There are multiple narrations that you find in Devanayak, this particular novel. There is a friction that you experience between fiction, reality and myth, and the central narrator, who is in fact a script writer, plays with an alternative mode of understanding the Tamil Elam's mythical past, fraught with ethnic history. The same thing that you can find in A Maggot. They problematize history. Now I will take a break and just view. I request Anuja to play the video so that we'll conclude this session.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you play the video for them?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Hope you have stopped screen sharing the presentation. Yes.
Yes. Is that okay now?
Yeah. Ma'am, is it visible?
പയ്യൂരിനടുത്ത് മുല്ലയാറിന്റെ തീരത്താണ് മഞ്ഞപ്പാറ. കേട്ടുകേൾവികളും വാമൊഴിയായി പകർന്നു കിട്ടിയ ആചാര വിചാരങ്ങളുമായി ഇവിടുത്തെ ചെറുജനം ജീവിച്ചു പോന്നു. ഈ ശവക്കോട്ടയ്ക്ക് അരികിലായി കാണുന്നതാണ് പെരേരയുടെ വീട്. ശവക്കോട്ടയുടെ സൂക്ഷിപ്പുകാരനാണ് വിൽസൺ പെരേര. പെരേര ഒരു പ്രത്യേക തരക്കാരനായിരുന്നു. സ്വന്തം വിശ്വാസങ്ങളും സങ്കല്പങ്ങളുമായി വീട്ടിൽ ഒതുങ്ങിക്കഴിയുന്നതാണ് പെരേരയ്ക്കിഷ്ടം. പാചകകലയിൽ അതിനിപുണനാണ് പെരേര. നിറങ്ങളും വെളിച്ചവുമായി നിന്ന മേഘമാലകൾക്ക് താഴെ എന്തിനേയും പെരേരയ്ക്ക് ഇഷ്ടമായിരുന്നു. പുൽച്ചാടിയായാലും പൂമീനായാലും വല്ലാത്തൊരിഷ്ടം. ഇതെല്ലാം പെരേരയുടെ ഒടുങ്ങിപ്പോയ പ്രിയപ്പെട്ടവരുടെ ചിത്രങ്ങളാണ്. ചില നേരങ്ങളിൽ ചുറ്റിലും ഇവയുടെ സാന്നിധ്യം പെരേര അനുഭവിച്ചിരുന്നു. ഇതാണ് പെരേര. പഞ്ഞിപ്പൂ മുടിയുള്ള ഉണങ്ങിയ കൈകാലുകളും വളഞ്ഞ ഉടലുമുള്ള പെരേര. പെരേര ഇന്ന് അങ്ങേയറ്റം ക്ഷീണിതനും ദുഃഖിതനുമാണ്. മറ്റാർക്കും തന്നെ അറിയാത്തതാണ് ഈ പെരേരയുടെ സങ്കടങ്ങൾ. അവ ഉറവകളായി മുഖക്കോണുകളിൽ ഒലിച്ചിറങ്ങി വീണു പൊട്ടി. പെരേരയുടെ കൊച്ചു പൂമീനുകൾ ചുവരിലെ ചിത്രമാവുകയാണ്. ഇന്നലെ വരെ എല്ലാം ശാന്തമായിരുന്നു. കഴിഞ്ഞു പോയത് വല്ലാത്തൊരു രാത്രിയാണ്. കാറ്റും മഴയും മിന്നലും കാടിളക്കി വന്ന രാത്രി. ഈ രാത്രി മഴയിൽ മുല്ലയാറും നിറഞ്ഞു കാണും. രാത്രിയിൽ എപ്പോഴോ എല്ലാം ശാന്തമായി. എന്നത്തെയും പോലെ രാവിലെ സ്വന്തം പൂമീനുകളെ കാണുവാൻ എത്തിയപ്പോൾ പെരേര പരിഭ്രാന്തനായി. അയ്യോ, എവിടെ എവിടെ എന്റെ മീൻകുട്ടികൾ? എന്റെ ദൈവമേ! എടാ ചെമ്പ, നീയാണോ എന്റെ മീൻകുട്ടികളെ കൊണ്ടുപോയത്? പറ, പറഞ്ഞില്ലെങ്കിൽ പട്ടച്ചൂലെടുക്കണോ ഞാൻ?
അയ്യോ, ഞാനല്ല.
ഞാൻ നിങ്ങളെ കണ്ടില്ല. എനിക്ക് ഉറപ്പാണ് എടുത്തത് അവനായിരിക്കും. കാലി. ശാന്തമായ തെളിമയുള്ള പകലായിരുന്നു ഇന്നലെ. ഇരുട്ടു വീണു, പിന്നെ ഇടിവെട്ടി മഴ പെയ്തു. തോരാ മഴ. അപ്പോഴാണ് കാലി കലിതുള്ളി കാളിയനായത്. ആർത്തലച്ച് വാ പിളർത്തി വന്ന് കടിച്ച് തീർത്തതാണ് ഈ കാളിയൻ. ഇടത്തമ്മാടി, കരിങ്കാലി. പെരേര അലറി. അയ്യോ, അല്ലേ അല്ല, അത് ഞാനല്ല. എനിക്കത് സാധിക്കില്ല. ഞാനല്ല. മഴ പൊട്ടും മുമ്പ് കളിച്ച് രസിക്കുകയായിരുന്നു മീൻകുട്ടികൾ. ഇടിവെട്ടി, ഇരുട്ടു വീണു, പിന്നെ മഴ പെയ്തു. വീശിയെടുത്തു ചെമ്പൻ. ഒന്ന് വെച്ച് കടിച്ചു കീറി തീർത്തതാണിവൻ. കണ്ടില്ലേ കണ്ടില്ലേ അവന്റെ തേറ്റകൾ. ആ! പെരേര മടുത്തു കൂവിയിട്ടു. മരപ്പാളി കൂട്ടങ്ങളിൽ നിന്ന് ഒന്നെടുത്ത് പെരേര പണി തുടങ്ങി. പൂമീനുകൾ ചുവരിൽ ചിത്രമാവുകയാണ്. പെരേര പൂമീനുകളുടെ ചിത്രത്തിലേക്ക് നോക്കി നിന്നു. ആരാണ് എന്റെ മീൻകുട്ടികളെ എടുത്തത്? ഒടുവിൽ ചുവരിലെ ചിത്രങ്ങൾക്കിടയിൽ പൂമീനുകളെയും പെരേര തൂക്കിയിട്ടു. സത്യം ആരുടേതാണ്? ഒന്ന് എന്റേത്, എന്റെ സ്വന്തം. രണ്ട് ചുറ്റുമുള്ളവരുടേത്. അവർ നിർമ്മിക്കുന്നത്, അവരെ രക്ഷിക്കുന്നത്, അവരെ ആഹ്ലാദിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. ഇനിയുമുണ്ട് ഒന്ന്. അതാവാം സത്യം. സത്യമായ സത്യം. നിറങ്ങളും വെളിച്ചവുമായി നിന്ന മേഘമാലകൾക്ക് താഴെ എന്തിനേയും പെരേരയ്ക്ക് ഇഷ്ടമായിരുന്നു. പുൽച്ചാടിയായാലും പൂമീനായാലും കൊതിമാറാത്തൊരിഷ്ടം.
I think we are concluding. Thank you for the patient listening. This was, I could have just, you can reflect on this. So there are 3 different narratives about Pereira's, what happened to the fish. What happened to the fish. And there are 3 narratives that you see there. And we could assume that Pereira might have been the villain. So this is what happens to history. This is how history is manipulated. There are so many different narratives. We do not know what to believe. So this particular short film, this particular video was so, so appealing that I thought I should share it with you. And this explains today's whole deliberation. That is, a powerful and ancient root is exhumed, and on it is laid bare an ageless wound. And I conclude by saying that these roots speak, the words grow, and the discourse take root in a wound, blurring the boundaries of fiction and history. Thank you. And because it is too late, I can take in questions. You can email me questions. So I would be happy to answer if you have any. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for the wonderful session. As ma'am rightly said, it's a bit late. So maybe if you have questions, please mail.
You can mail me.
Please mail to Dr. Latha Nair's email ID, which will be provided in the WhatsApp group. Now to propose vote of thanks, I invite Anupa Gopan, Ms. Anupa Gopan, Assistant Professor, Maharaja's College, Cochin.
Good evening, everyone. Now we come to the end of our webinar series, Engaging Theory, and I feel so happy to propose the vote of thanks. Thank you, everyone. the age in which we live now is a post-truth period. And as I listened to the wonderful presentation on narratives and the truth, I feel our life is alienated or detached from the historical continuity, and it has become a narrative or even a fantasy created by others. And so, Latha ma'am, thank you for presenting a very important and relevant topic. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and also your valuable time with us. We are so honored and happy that you consented to be part of this seminar. And I know that you got only a very limited time and also the technical glitches. And after listening to your talk, I really wish to hear more on this topic. And I really wish that you bring out a book on this topic. And thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful analysis of the novels Maggot and Sugandhi and Andal Devanayaki, which gave us a real clear picture of historiographic metafiction. And hats off to the title, Lying with History, and I am sure that the pun was intended. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you. Now
I
I
took
extend my... Yes, ma'am.
I can't hear you. I mean, is
Oh,
it
I'm
my?
sorry.
It's
Can you
okay.
hear me?
It's
Now I
audible.
can.
Yes.
Now I am. Now you are. Now you are. Yes. It's okay. It's okay.
You are audible, Anuba. We could hear you. Maybe ma'am couldn't.
Okay. If you couldn't hear, I think then there is no
That is-
purpose actually.
That's okay. That is okay. We can't keep the others waiting. I accept.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And also I extend my sincere gratitude to all the participants of the webinar and for people who are going to pose the question and responses. And I extend my gratitude to the Department of English, Sree Sankara College, Kalady, for organizing such a series of scholarly talks. I thank the faculty of English, my guide Vinod sir, Preeti ma'am, and others for the conduct of the seminar. And above all, I extend my sincere gratitude to Anjana ma'am for giving me a chance to propose the vote of thanks. Then, though we are a family, but to me, expressing gratitude is the most beautiful gesture. I sincerely thank my fellow research scholars for your participation off screen and on screen. Thank you all. Thank you, Latha ma'am, once again. And also, I take this opportunity to wish you all a very happy Onam. Thank you. Stay home and enjoy. Thank you.
And from my side also, I wish you all a very happy Onam. The times are so stressful, but even then there is a ray of hope and peace within. Wish you all success. Thank you, Anjana, for all your love and bearing with me. I think, please forgive me if I encroached on your time. I apologize. I mean, I do not know whether I exceeded time.
No, ma'am. No,
So
ma'am. We
much.
didn't have enough. We didn't have enough of your talk actually. But since you must be tired after the series of award presentations and all the ceremonies which are going on for the past 1 week, we don't want to tax you.
No,
As-
I would send those, whatever I have prepared. I had elaborated on metafiction. There is plenty of information that is available. I would be too happy to share with those notes, with those observations that I have made. I have already mailed these slides. If it is useful, you can use it. And the help that I received was from my young friend, Ms. Junie Thomas, who structured the whole presentation. Thank you so much.
Ma'am, it was wonderful. The last video that you showed with Mohanlal's voiceover, there are quite a few Mohanlal fans, I think. They would have enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Anyway, happy Onam to you and happy Onam to all the participants also. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Polemical.